Zoraide didn't just look at Kang Elian. She targeted him. Amid the clatter of the diner, she ignored her tables, crossed the floor with a desperate, white-knuckled focus, and leaned into his personal space. With her hands clasped in a trembling plea, she whispered a lie that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Please, pretend you're my fiancé." Elian's hand didn't flinch, but it stopped an inch above his tea. His face remained a mask of deadly stillness, but his eyes drifted past her to the rain-slicked window. Malak was there, a broad, jagged shadow pressing against the glass, his silhouette radiating a chaotic violence that promised to turn the restaurant into a crime scene. Elian looked back at the woman in the server's apron. He didn't see a waitress. He saw a person standing at the mouth of a grave. He didn't stand. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply exhaled a single, cold command. "Sit," he said, his voice a velvet anchor. "Look only at me. I'll handle the monster." The bell above the door chimed, a sharp, metallic warning. Malak stormed in, but he had no idea he'd just walked into his own graveyard. Zoraide had come in from the rain alone, her server's shirt soaked through, the chaos of her past snapping at her heels. Her eyes swept the room once and locked onto Kang Elian. Not away from him, at him. She crossed the room with a focused terror, rose onto her toes, and whispered, "Please, pretend you're my fiancé." Elian's hand stopped midair over his tea. His face went cold. His eyes moved past her to the glass door where Malak stood, a heavy, lunging figure silhouetted against the streetlights. Elian looked back at the woman. He catalogued her wide, glassy eyes and the way she had completely abandoned her professional persona because she was fighting for her life. He didn't set down his cup. "Sit," he said quietly. "Don't look back. I'll handle the monster." Kang Elian had not chosen this life the way most men in it had. He hadn't been recruited off a street corner or clawed his way up through desperation. He had been selected quietly, deliberately, the way a high-end blade is chosen from a rack. At 19, the elders of the syndicate had seen something in him that he hadn't yet recognized. Stillness. In a world of loud, chaotic men like Malak, stillness was the rarest weapon of all. 15 years later, that stillness had built him an empire. He moved through the city like silk, invisible, essential, and untouchable. The police had a file on him. His rivals had a target on him. Neither had ever touched him. He was a man of action who didn't need to show off his wealth or his scars. But tonight, he was tired in a way that sleep couldn't touch. Tonight was supposed to be 20 minutes of being a man with no name. He had sent his detail away because the air smelled of rain and his lungs needed something honest. He was sitting with that thought when the door opened and Zoraide walked in. He watched her the way he watched everything, without expression. He saw the way she moved across the room with a terror that was too directional to be simple fear. She wasn't just lost. She was hunted. Elian recognized it immediately because he had seen it in witnesses who knew they were already dead. Her eyes found him and aimed. He watched the rest of the restaurant fail to register the storm that had just walked in. She stopped at his booth and whispered her impossible request. He felt her breath warm, trembling. "Please pretend you're my fiancé." Now his hand stopped over his tea. The cold moved through him like clarity. He looked at Malak, who was stepping through the door with the particular deliberateness of a man who thought he was the most dangerous thing in the room. Elian took 3 seconds, unhurried and precise, to read the details. Zoraide's apron was pulled tight, hiding a narrative of survival she hadn't yet shared. Malak wasn't just an ex. He was a predator about to hit a wall. Elian slid his phone from his pocket and sent a single character to his men. A period. "Come now. Silent. Armed." Then he looked at Zoraide, this woman who had walked into the most dangerous booth in the city and handed him the weight of her life. "Eat," he said quietly, sliding a bowl toward her. "Don't look back." Malak pushed through the door. He was a broad, boxy man, a brute who distributed his weight like a lunging animal. He walked directly toward the booth, his mouth open in a distorted snarl, ready to reclaim his prize. He noted the sharp man in the black shirt but didn't look up. He had no idea the stillness was about to kill him. Zoraide's breath hitched as she slid into the booth, her hands trembling so hard the rice grains fell from her spoon. She didn't look back at the door, but she could hear it. The heavy, wet thud of boots on the floor and the low, guttural growl that could only belong to Malak. The air in the diner suddenly felt thin and cold, as if the storm from outside had finally burst through the walls. Malak's shadow fell over the table like a dark shroud. He was a massive man, smelling of rain and old anger. He didn't even look at the man sitting across from Zoraide. He only saw her, his prize, his target. He reached out a thick, scarred hand toward her shoulder, his fingers curling like claws. "I told you there's nowhere to hide, Zoraide," he rasped, his voice dripping with a cruel satisfaction. "Get up. We're leaving." That was when the world seemed to stop moving. Kang Elian finally set his teacup down. The tiny click of porcelain against wood was quiet, but in the sudden silence of the restaurant, it sounded like a gunshot. He didn't shout. He didn't even look angry. He simply stood up. It was a slow, effortless movement, but it changed the entire energy of the room. Elian was leaner than Malak, but he stood with a terrifying, solid grace. He was like a mountain rising out of the sea. He stepped out of the booth and moved between Zoraide and the man who haunted her. He stood so close to Malak that their chests almost touched, yet Elian looked as relaxed as if he were standing alone in a garden. "You're at the wrong table," Elian said. His voice was a low, smooth velvet that made the hair on the back of Zoraide's neck stand up. Malak sneered, his face twisting into a mask of bravado. "Who do you think you are, pretty boy? Move aside before I break you in half." Elian didn't move an inch. He simply looked into Malak's eyes with a flat, empty gaze. It was the look of a man who had seen everything and feared nothing. In that moment, the stillness Zoraide had sensed earlier became a physical weight. The restaurant staff stopped moving. The other customers held their breath. Malak's smirk began to fade. He looked at Elian's expensive black shirt, his perfectly groomed hair, and then finally into those cold, calculating eyes. He saw the way Elian's hands stayed relaxed at his sides, not clenched into fists, but ready. Malak was a bully who used noise and size to get his way, but for the first time in his life, he realized he was standing in front of a real predator. He realized that if he moved a single finger, he wouldn't just be in a fight, he would be in a graveyard. A bead of sweat rolled down Malak's temple, mixing with the rainwater. His chest stopped heaving. The aggressive fire in his eyes went out, replaced by a sudden, sharp realization of danger. He took a half step back, then another. The silence was so heavy it felt like it might crush him. "This isn't over," Malak hissed, but his voice lacked its usual bite. He turned around and stumbled back toward the door, his boots squeaking on the floor. The bell chimed as he vanished into the rainy night. Elian didn't watch him leave. He turned back to Zoraide, his face softening just a fraction. "Eat your rice, Zoraide," he said softly. "You're safe now." The diner felt different after Malak left. The air was still, but the safety felt like a thin sheet of glass that could shatter at any moment. Zoraide looked down at her hands, which were still shaking against the wooden table. She was still wearing her brown apron and the dark shirt that smelled of rain and work, but she felt like she didn't belong in her own skin anymore. "We cannot stay here," Elian said. His voice was calm, but it had a hidden strength that made Zoraide stand up without a second thought. He didn't grab her arm or rush her. He simply walked to the door, and she followed him like a person drifting in a dream. Outside, a long black car was waiting at the curb. The engine hummed quietly, sounding like a powerful animal waiting to run. A man in a suit opened the door for them, bowing his head slightly as they stepped inside. As the car pulled away from the diner, Zoraide watched the bright neon lights of the city blur into streaks of light against the wet windows. She was leaving the only world she knew for a place she couldn't even imagine. They drove for a long time, moving away from the crowded streets and up into the quiet hills. Eventually, they stopped in front of a massive gate that opened slowly, revealing a house that looked more like a castle than a home. It was made of dark stone and glass, standing tall against the stormy sky. This was Elian's fortress. Inside, the floors were made of polished marble that echoed with every step. Elian led her to a large, quiet room where a woman was waiting with a stack of soft clothes. "Change," Elian said softly. "You need to rest." Zoraide went into the side room and peeled off her wet, heavy waitress uniform. She dropped the brown apron on the floor, feeling a strange sense of loss. She put on the clothes they had given her. A set of pajamas made of deep blue silk. The fabric was so smooth it felt like cool water against her skin. It was the most expensive thing she had ever touched. She looked at herself in the tall mirror. Without her apron and the name tag pinned to her chest, she looked like a different person. She looked like someone who belonged in a mansion, someone who was protected and safe. But when she looked into her own eyes, she saw the same terror staring back. She walked back into the main room where Elian was standing by a massive window, looking out at the dark trees. Even in the silence of this beautiful house, Zoraide felt a chill. The silk was soft, but it couldn't hide the truth. She was in a world of monsters now, and while one monster was gone, she was now living in the home of the most dangerous one of all. Elian turned to look at her, his eyes tracing the way the silk fell over her shoulders. He didn't say anything, but the air in the room grew heavy. Zoraide realized that her old life was over. She was safe from Malak, but the real story was only just beginning. Elian stood by the window for a long time, watching the rain hit the glass. Zoraide sat on the edge of the large bed, her fingers brushing the smooth blue silk of her new clothes. The room was so quiet she could hear the ticking of a clock down the hall. She looked at Elian's back, wondering who this man really was. He was the one who had saved her, but he felt like a mystery wrapped in a shadow. He began to speak without turning around. His voice was low, and he told her about a time long ago. Before the mansion and the expensive cars, Elian had been a different person. He grew up in a world where everyone was shouting and fighting. Most men around him were loud and angry, like Malak. They thought that being the loudest made them the strongest. But Elian saw things differently. He noticed that the man who stayed quiet was the one who survived. When he was only 19, the leaders of his family's business saw a special spark in him. It wasn't a spark of fire, but a spark of ice. They called it Stillness. While other young men were losing their tempers, Elian could stand in the middle of a storm and not blink. He learned to lock his feelings away in a small, dark box deep inside his heart. He decided that if he never felt sad, he could never be hurt. If he never felt angry, he could never make a mistake. Year after year, he built his empire. He didn't use messy violence or loud threats. He used his mind and his silence. He became known as a man who could fix any problem without ever raising his voice. He made the city follow his rules by being a wall that no one could climb. But as his power grew, the man inside started to disappear. He had become so good at not feeling anything that he forgot how to be happy or how to trust anyone. Zoraide listened to his story, feeling a strange sadness for him. He had everything a person could want, yet he seemed as lonely as she was. He had traded his emotions for safety and power. He was the king of stillness, but that meant he was also the king of a very cold, empty world. Elian finally turned away from the window. The moonlight hit his face, making his sharp features look even more like a statue. For a second, Zoraide thought she saw a flicker of something human in his eyes. A tiny crack in the ice. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she realized that perhaps she was the first person in years to hear the truth about his past. The silence between them wasn't scary anymore. It was a shared secret. The heavy silence of the room was broken by a soft knock at the door. One of Elian's men entered, holding the brown canvas apron Zoraide had been wearing at the diner. It was still damp from the rain and stained with coffee and old work. Zoraide watched as Elian took the apron from his assistant. He didn't look at it like it was trash. He looked at it like it was a puzzle. Elian ran his long, steady fingers along the thick hem at the bottom of the apron. He stopped at a corner where the stitching looked a bit too thick, a bit too heavy. With a small, sharp pocket knife, he carefully sliced through the fabric. Zoraide leaned forward, her heart racing. She had worn that apron for months, but she had never known it held anything but her pens and notepad. From inside the lining, a small, flat silver object slid out. It was a microledger, a tiny book of digital secrets. Elian held it up to the light, his eyes narrowing. He didn't have to say a word for Zoraide to know this was bad. This wasn't just about a mean ex-boyfriend anymore. This was much bigger. "Your father," Elian said, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "He didn't just leave you this job. He left you a target." Zoraide felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Her father had worked at that same diner for years before he passed away. He was a quiet man who kept to himself, but now she realized he had been hiding something that powerful people would kill to get back. The ledger likely contained names, dates, and amounts of money, proof of a massive conspiracy involving the city's most dangerous leaders. Malak wasn't chasing her because he missed her. He had been sent by someone else to get that silver book. Suddenly, the walls of the mansion felt less like a palace and more like a fortress under siege. Zoraide realized she wasn't just a girl who needed a fake fiancé. She was the key to a war that could burn the whole city down. Elian looked at the ledger and then back at Zoraide. For the first time, his stillness felt like a shield he was sharing with her. He knew that by keeping her here, he was inviting a storm into his own home. The stakes had changed. It wasn't just about her safety anymore. It was about a secret that could destroy everyone they knew. "They will come for this," Elian said, his eyes turning back into ice. "And they will have to go through me to get it." The silver microledger sat on the table between them, a tiny object that had turned Zoraide's world upside down. To keep her safe, Elian knew they couldn't just hide in the shadows of the mansion. They had to step into the light and show the city that she was under his personal protection. He organized a grand gala, a party filled with powerful people, where they would debut their engagement to the world. A team of stylists arrived at the fortress to transform Zoraide once again. They dressed her in a floor-length gown of shimmering gold that glowed against her dark skin. Her braids were adorned with tiny, sparkling crystals that caught the light like fallen stars. When she stepped out into the hallway, Elian was waiting. He wore a tuxedo that was as black as the night sky, looking every bit like the king he was. "Remember," Elian whispered as they pulled up to the glittering ballroom, "you are not a waitress tonight. You are mine. Do not let them see you blink." The moment they walked into the room, the music seemed to fade. Hundreds of eyes turned toward them. Zoraide felt a wave of panic wash over her, her heart drumming against her ribs. She felt like a bird trapped in a cage of gold. But then, she felt Elian's hand slide firmly around her waist. His palm was warm and steady, a silent anchor in the sea of staring faces. They moved through the crowd like a single unit. Elian played the part of the doting fiancé perfectly. He leaned in close to whisper names of officials in her ear, his breath brushing against her cheek. He tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that surprised her. To everyone else, it looked like pure romance, but Zoraide knew it was a performance. However, as the night went on, the lines began to blur. When Elian led her to the center of the dance floor, the world around them disappeared. He held her close, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that wasn't part of any script. For the first time, his stillness didn't feel cold. It felt like a shield made of heat. Zoraide found herself leaning into him, her hand resting on his shoulder as if she truly belonged there. She forgot about the ledger, forgot about Malak, and forgot about the danger waiting in the dark. For a few minutes, the fake feelings felt dangerously real. She saw a flicker of something soft in Elian's gaze, a light that shouldn't have been there if this was just a game. They were supposed to be acting, but as the music swelled, Zoraide realized that the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't the enemies watching them. It was the way her heart sped up every time Elian tightened his grip. The glow of the gala felt like a distant memory as the car sped back toward the industrial side of the city. The gold dress Zoraide wore seemed too bright for the dark, rainy docks where they eventually stopped. Elian's phone had buzzed only once during the drive, a silent signal that his world was under attack. He didn't look worried, but his jaw was set tight like a piece of iron. They arrived at a massive warehouse near the water where Elian's most important shipments were kept. The air here was thick with the smell of salt and diesel fuel. Suddenly, the quiet night was shattered by the sound of tires screeching and the bright flash of gunfire. Zoraide ducked behind the heavy door of the car, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't just a loud argument in a diner anymore. This was a war. Through the rain, a group of men moved with perfect timing. They wore black tactical gear and moved like shadows. At the front of the group was Malak. But he didn't look like the messy, angry man from before. He was calm, carrying a heavy weapon and barking orders like a captain. He wasn't just a bitter ex-boyfriend. He was a professional mercenary. He had been trained for this, and he had a team of killers behind him. "He's not after me?" Zoraide whispered, realizing the truth as she watched Malak blow the lock off a shipping container. "He's after the ledger." Malak had used his past with her just to get close, but his real job was to take back the secrets her father had hidden. He was working for the very people Elian had spent his life fighting. Elian stepped out into the open, his black tuxedo making him look like a ghost in the fog. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He stood in the middle of the yard, watching the mercenaries scramble. His stillness was back, but now it felt sharp, like a sword pulled from its sheath. He raised a hand, and suddenly, his own men appeared from the shadows of the warehouse, surrounding Malak's team. Malak stopped and looked up, his eyes meeting Elian's across the distance. The rain poured down between them, soaking Elian's expensive clothes. Malak pointed his weapon at the King of Stillness, a wicked grin spreading across his face. He thought he had the upper hand because he had brought more guns, but he didn't understand that Elian didn't need noise to win. "You're out of your league, Malak." Elian's voice carried through the wind, steady and cold. The two sides stood frozen for a moment, waiting for the first person to blink. Zoraide watched from the car, realizing that her life was now the center of a giant chess game. Malak had shown his true colors as a professional soldier, but Elian was showing why he ruled the city. The fake engagement had turned into a real battle, and the docks were about to become a very dangerous place. The rain poured down harder, turning the shipyard into a maze of shadows and steel. Giant shipping containers stood like iron mountains, dripping with water and grease. Zoraide stayed low in the car, her eyes fixed on Elian. He didn't look like a man about to fight. He looked like a shadow himself. With a small wave of his hand, he signaled his men, and suddenly the bright floodlights of the port flickered and died. Total darkness swallowed the shipyard. Malak's team shouted in confusion. Zoraide heard the clatter of boots on wet pavement and the frantic clicking of flashlights. Malak's voice boomed through the storm, angry and loud, ordering his mercenaries to stay together. But the shipyard was too big, and the rain was too thick. One by one, the beams of their flashlights disappeared into the gaps between the massive containers. Elian moved through the dark without making a sound. He knew this port better than anyone. He used the maze of steel to draw Malak's men away from each other. Zoraide listened closely. She heard a soft thud here, a muffled cry there, followed by the heavy silence of the night. It wasn't a loud, messy battle. It was a tactical hunt. Elian was using his stillness as a weapon, picking apart the mercenary team until only one man was left standing. Malak was alone now, standing in an open space between two towering stacks of crates. He spun around, waving his weapon wildly, his face pale with fear. The brutal shadow was finally afraid. He had brought a small army, but the silence of the port had defeated them. He was a professional, but he was fighting a ghost. A single light flickered back on, casting a long, sharp shadow across the ground. Elian stepped into the light, his tuxedo still looking crisp despite the rain. He didn't have a gun in his hand. He didn't need one. He stood 10 feet away from Malak, his expression as calm as it had been at the diner. The trap was closed, and Malak was caught right in the center of it. Zoraide watched from the distance, her breath fogging up the car window. She realized then that Elian's power wasn't just about money or soldiers. It was about his ability to stay calm when everyone else was screaming. The storm in the port was raging all around them, but the real power was the man standing perfectly still in the middle of it. Malak lunged forward, his face twisted in a desperate snarl, but he was stumbling over his own feet. He was exhausted, wet, and broken. Elian simply watched him come, ready to end the game once and for all. Malak's feet splashed through the deep puddles as he charged, his face a mask of sweaty desperation. He swung his heavy weapon like a club, but Elian moved like a shadow in the wind. With a quick, sharp motion, Elian stepped to the side and struck Malak's wrist. The weapon clattered onto the wet concrete, sliding far out of reach. Malak stumbled, gasping for air, his eyes darting around the dark shipyard for an escape that didn't exist. "It's over, Malak," Elian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the sound of the falling rain like a blade. "You were never a soldier. You were just a bully in a uniform." Malak let out a jagged laugh, his chest heaving. "You think you've won? The people I work for, they won't stop. They'll burn this whole city to get that ledger. And they'll start with her." He lunged again, pulling a small, hidden knife from his belt. The blade glinted under the single flickering light. Zoraide watched from the car, her heart racing. For a second, her mind flashed back to all the times Malak had made her feel small, all the nights she had spent trembling in fear. The brutal shadow had haunted her for so long. She looked at Elian, who was calmly blocking Malak's strikes, but she saw the mercenary's hand reaching for a heavy metal pipe on the ground. Elian didn't see it. He was focused on the knife. In that moment, something inside Zoraide snapped. The fear that had kept her quiet for years suddenly turned into a hot, bright spark of courage. She didn't want to be the victim anymore. She didn't want to be the girl hiding in the back of the car while someone else fought her battles. She threw open the car door and stepped out into the freezing rain. Her gold dress was heavy and soaked, but she didn't care. She spotted a heavy wooden block used to steady the shipping containers. She grabbed it with both hands, the rough wood scraping her palms. As Malak raised the metal pipe to strike Elian's head from behind, Zoraide screamed, "No!" She ran forward, the silk of her dress tearing as she moved. Before Malak could swing, she slammed the wooden block into his arm with every bit of strength she had. The pipe fell to the ground with a loud clang. Malak yelled in pain, spinning around to face her, his eyes wide with shock. He couldn't believe the girl who used to hide from him was now standing her ground. That split second was all Elian needed. He moved with a speed Zoraide couldn't follow, landing a final blow that sent Malak crashing to the ground. The mercenary stayed down this time, his shadow finally broken by the very woman he had tried to destroy. Zoraide stood there, breathing hard, her hair wild and wet. She looked at Malak, and for the first time he looked small. The terror that had lived in her chest for years was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet peace. Elian walked over to her, his eyes soft. He didn't say a word, but he reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm, and for the first time it didn't feel like a part of a play. Felt like home. The rain had finally slowed to a soft mist by the time they returned to the mansion. The silence of the great stone halls didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like a blanket. Zoraide stood in the center of the living room, her gold dress ruined and stained with the salt of the shipyard. She looked at her hands, still red from holding the wooden block, and realized she was no longer the girl who had walked into that diner begging for her life. She was someone who had fought for it. Elian stood by the fireplace, the orange flames casting long shadows across his sharp features. He had changed back into a simple black shirt, and his slicked-back hair was slightly mussed. The fake engagement was technically over. Malak was in the hands of Elian's men, the ledger was locked away in a safe, and the danger that had chased Zoraide through the streets was gone. There was no reason for her to stay in this fortress of silk and stone. "Your old life is waiting for you, Zoraide," Elian said quietly. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the dancing fire. "The diner is safe. Malak will never bother you again. I can have my men drive you back to your apartment in the morning." Zoraide looked around the room. She thought about her small, quiet apartment and the long shifts at the restaurant where she was just a face in the crowd. She thought about the stillness of this house and the man who had stood like a wall between her and the storm. The ruse was finished, the acting was done, but the space between them felt heavier than ever. "Is that what you want?" Zoraide asked, her voice steady and clear. "For me to go back to being just a waitress?" Elian finally turned to look at her. The icy mask he usually wore was gone, replaced by something honest and raw. He walked toward her, his boots silent on the marble floor. He stopped just a few inches away, his presence as powerful as it had been the first night they met. "I spent 20 years building a world where I didn't have to feel anything," he whispered. "I thought stillness was my strength. But then you walked into my diner and asked me to be someone I wasn't. And for a moment, I liked that man better." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "The acting is over, Zoraide. But I don't want you to leave. My table has been empty for a long time. I want you to have a permanent seat at it. Not as a waitress and not as a girl I'm protecting, but as the person who finally broke my silence." Zoraide looked into his dark eyes and saw the king of stillness, offering her a kingdom. She realized she didn't want to run anymore, and she didn't want to hide. She squeezed his hand, her heart finally finding its rhythm. "I think I'd like that," she said with a small, knowing smile. The fake engagement was dead, but something much more real had begun. They stood together in the quiet of the mansion, two people who had started as strangers in a storm and ended as anchors for each other. The waitress and the boss were gone. There was only Elian and Zoraide, and a future they would build together, one quiet moment at a time.